Thank you all. It's a pleasure being home in Atlanta and being here with a number of friends and relatives who've come as well, and with all of you who've taken time on a Monday morning in the middle of the summer to come do this rather than other things. So I want to thank you all for being here, and I want to thank my colleagues from the Concert Corps who are here as well. Richard DeMayo and I are graduated from Northside High School, which is really right down the corner of Arden and Northside Drive. Used to be, until they changed the name. And when we graduated, I don't want to really tell you how many years ago it was, because it's been a while. But when we graduated, Atlanta was a small regional city. I mean, I can remember when that sign on Peachtree that has the population ticking, you know, when it hit 1 million, and that was a big deal. When I left Atlanta in 1971, Georgia, I think, had one office abroad in Brussels. There were a handful of consulates here in Atlanta, but almost all of them were local business people who were honorary consulates, and there were very, very few who were career diplomats. Since that time, and what has happened in Atlanta and Georgia is extraordinary. The Carter Center, the Southern Center, I think, was open in 1977, wasn't it? But it certainly wasn't here. I think you were in a broom closet somewhere. I don't know. We've had the Carter Center, CNN in Espanol, so it means people all over the Spanish-speaking world are watching the news coming from Atlanta. CFIL Atlanta, which is just a tremendous organization. As the commissioner mentioned, we got Mr. Fernandez mentioned, we got the America's Competitiveness Forum here in August. I was at last year's forum, and it was extraordinary. I mean, absolutely extraordinary, with people getting together, private sector, central government, but I would say even more importantly were provincial, state, municipal governments from around Latin America to come to talk to each other about how to make their areas more competitive. It's been extraordinary. Here's some data that y'all know. The other thing I like about being here is I can talk my own lingo. Okay, that all of y'all know is that in 2006, the Atlanta area exported $11.4 billion, just the Atlanta area. That's about 60% of what Georgia exports, which is $20 billion. The Atlanta airport, as we all know, is the busiest airport in the world, but 8 million international passengers a year, 390,000 tons of international cargo moving through the Atlanta airport. The Port of Savannah is the 4th largest container port in the United States, and it was, I think it still is, the fastest growing container port in the United States. Georgia's now got 9 offices. There are 33 binational chambers of commerce here in the Atlanta area. Trade supports 1 out of every 5 jobs in Georgia. 112,000 Georgians work directly for foreign companies. Those jobs pay 20% more than jobs that are not involved in the export sector. And exports, of course, are growing much more quickly than GDP. All that is great, but I got to tell y'all, when I go around the United States and give speeches about trade, it's like that, you know, that ad on TV where the guy's interviewing for a job? It played on Super Bowl. I know you all saw it. And he's got the big spot on his shirt. And the guy, the personnel director who's doing the interview, all he can hear is the spot on the shirt talking. When I go and talk about trade, all people can hear is this gigantic spot on my shirt. And what it's really saying to them is, my job's going to China, and here's some guy from Washington down here in a coat and tie who's trying to tell me that's okay. Right? I'm serious. People are afraid of trade, and we've seen that in our presidential campaign. And you can, you can hear it real easily. I spoke 2 weeks ago at an event in Washington, and the first question was from a guy who was just mad as can be. He was furious, and gave me one of these, finger-pointing questions. And we talked later, and he is the union representative at the General Motors plant in Doraville, which has gotten orders to shut down on the 26th of September, and he's mad as hell, and ought to be. We all would be if we were losing our job. And that's part of the problem talking about trade, is that we, the guys with coats and ties, we talk about macro data. We talk about how well things are doing in the macro, GDP and foreign investment flows and all of these sorts of things. Voters live in the micro economy, not in the macro economy. And what they are concerned about is, am I going to have my job? Is my life going to get better? Am I going to have more money to spend? Or my kids going to have a better life than I have? And it is our job, and when I say our, I don't mean U.S. government's job alone. It's U.S. government, the executive branch. It is World Affairs councils around the country, Southern Center for International Studies. It is universities, and I would argue high schools and elementary schools, and our newspapers, who I can't get in to talk to the Journal-Constitution to save my life, that we need to talk to people about trade. We need to talk to people about trade. We need to convince them about trade. That Western Hemisphere part on my job title means that's what I focus on. Let me talk to you a little bit about trade with the Western Hemisphere. First of all, Western Hemisphere, in general terms, is booming. The economies are growing and doing really, really well. We have negotiated, in addition to our agreement with Canada and Mexico, right, NAFTA, we've got agreements with CAFTA, which are the Central American countries plus the Dominican Republic. We've got a bilateral agreement with Chile. Our exports to Chile have increased 230% since that agreement went into effect. And we've got these pending agreements with Peru, Colombia, and Panama. Peru, Colombia, and Panama. Now, let me tell you just a little bit about Peru, Colombia, and Panama, and I'll be glad to tell you more than you want to know, and hopefully you'll ask lots of questions. But what I get from people is, well, those countries are small. Who cares? Why does it matter? Here's why it matters. If you add Peru, Colombia, and Panama together, you're talking about over 80 million people with a combined economy of over $500 billion on a yearly basis. Actually, I believe last year, $577 billion, those three countries. That's significant. That's real. And now here's what makes it even more interesting, is that Peru last year grew at 8%. Colombia, I don't know if the final data for the year end, but it's right at 7%, above 7%, and Panama grew at 10% last year. Those of y'all who are in business know it's a lot easier to sell your services, to sell your products to a company that is expanding than to one whose business is declining. These countries are growing. There's a gigantic demand for products, and they're going to buy them, whether it's from the United States or somebody else. Let's make sure we not only maintain but increase our market share in these three countries. Congress, as you mentioned, Mr. Commissioner, approved the Peru agreement, I think it was December 14th, and we're in this implementation phase where, both sides have got to do things that we committed to do before it goes into effect, but hopefully early next year it will go into effect. Colombia is next. We sent it up to the Congress in April, and the Congress suspended the rules and stopped the clock from running so that it won't be voted on until the Speaker of the House says we're going to vote on it. And that's where we are right now, and we're trying to convince the Speaker to move ahead with this. And that's very hard in an election year. It's very hard any year because people are afraid of trade. Now, I guess y'all didn't see me come in, I brought some props here because I found that people, even business people, remarkably, have a hard time grasping this concept. So I hope y'all don't mind. When I give this speech around the country, I tell them this is a Georgia PowerPoint, okay? Because now, I'm going to ask my cousin Beth Ann Terra too. Can you tell what that is, Beth? Tell everybody what that is. It's a bag of coffee. Guess where this coffee's from? Colombia, right? Yeah, Colombia. And Camilo will tell you it's the best coffee in the world, right? Of course. This is the best coffee in the world. Now, I would like somebody here to tell me, just take a guess, not Camilo, how much duty, y'all know what tariffs are. I mean, we've got these young people out here who I find don't know what tariffs are. Tariffs are taxes you pay on imports, special taxes over and above other taxes. Anybody want to guess what the U.S. tariff on coffee imported from Colombia is? 15. Zero duty. Zero duty. This comes in duty-free. That's great. If you drink coffee, it means your coffee costs less because it comes in at zero. That's terrific. It's a good deal for us. It's a good deal for Colombia. Now, what I got right here, let's see, I bet somebody could identify this, right? It's a can of Pringles potato chips. I found out recently Pringles are made by Procter & Gamble Company, and they're made in, there's a plant in Jackson, Tennessee that produces Pringles. When these Pringles go into Colombia, somebody want to guess what the Colombian tariff is on Pringles? Say it? 30. A little high. Go a little bit lower. Good. 20%. I'm glad you got that. All right. You guys have to help me out. You people have to help me out here. So this pays 20%. So if Camilo were at home and he wanted to buy this, he would have to pay the cost of producing the Pringles, the cost of shipping the Pringles, the cost of whatever the profit is of the store, plus an additional 20%, right? And as a matter of fact, Procter & Gamble says they're not even going to bother shipping Pringles to Colombia until that tariff comes off because they don't think there's a market there for it until the tariff comes off, right? Now, here, I know y'all can identify these. Somebody want to tell me what kind of flowers these are? Very good. Roses. These are roses, right? These are actually plastic roses. But let's assume for the sake of this discussion that these are real roses. These are roses. Do y'all know when you go to Publix and buy roses to send your beloved, do you know where they come from? Colombia. Very good. Most of them come from Colombia. Some come from Ecuador. They're flown in through Atlanta Airport. And somebody tell me how much duty Colombian roses pay. Take a guess. Zero. You're a quick learner. Very good. Now, here's the hard part. I know some of you are gardeners. This is Miracle Grow, right? It's made in Maysville, Ohio, USA. The roses are grown hydroponically. They're not in the ground. They're grown hydroponically. If the rose grower wanted to put Miracle Grow in that mix of stuff that makes the roses grow, guess what the duty would be on Miracle Grow? 20%. 100%. 100%. Let me say it again. 100%. Here's the deal. 0, 100. 0, 100. Now, I'm going to guess that y'all can figure this out, that that's not right, is it? And we've got the solution. And the solution is this trade agreement that's pending before Congress. Colombia, Peru, Panama already have duty-free access to the United States for almost all of their products. I think in the case of Colombia, it's 92% of Colombian products enter the United States duty-free now. U.S. products going into Colombia pay, it varies depending on what the product is, but it can be from 5%, 10, 20% on processed foods, on agricultural products, unprocessed agricultural products, much more so that on chicken dark meat, chicken hindquarters and trade talk, it's 179%. That's a lot. We call these trade agreements free trade agreements because, you know, we were dumb. What we ought to call them is let's give American workers and farmers equal access agreements. That's what they're about. Let's give American workers and farmers equal access to the Colombian market that Colombian workers and farmers have to our market. And that's what it's all about. It is that simple. Seems pretty straightforward. Seems like something we ought to be able to do. Seems like something we ought to be able to figure out. But unfortunately, domestic U.S. politics, not surprisingly, have got this thing tied up. It's absolutely tied up, and it's tied up at a time when our economy is going into a downturn, and the only, I mean, that's not the only part. The part of the U.S. economy that is growing most strongly is our export sector. Our export sector. Exports were up 12% last year. I don't know what Georgia exports were up, but I'd be willing to bet it was above that. Our export sector was up. I think that's right. Yeah. Export sector was up 12% last year. Let's not have it grow 12% this year. Let's make it 15, 20%, right? That's what we want to do. So if you're the guy at the Pringles factory, right, there'll be more work. If you're the guy that grows the potatoes that go into Pringles or whatever other ingredients there are, I don't know what they are. Not sure I want it. Anyhow, that's what you want to see happen. For machinery, mining equipment, farm machinery, earth-moving equipment. There's a gigantic mining industry in Colombia, and they want to buy things, and they want to buy them from the United States. Now, here's the second complicating factor, and that is that Colombia, to its credit, 3 weeks ago, finished negotiating a free trade agreement with Canada. So that means if there's whatever the Canadian version of Pringles is, whatever the Canadian version of fertilizer is, if there are similar products, one's made in the United States and one's made in Canada, and there's a duty on the U.S. product going into Colombia, and there's zero duty going on the Canadian product entering Colombia, we're going to lose market share. It's not that, I mean, we're going to lose our sales to Colombia. And I got to tell you, I was stationed in Chile in the late 80s when that was exactly the case. Canada had an agreement with Chile, and we did not. At the time that I was there in 1998, U.S. had about 25% of all Chilean imports came from Canada. Our market share dropped to 14%. Okay, from 25% of all Chilean imports to 14% of all Chilean imports. We negotiated a trade agreement with them. It went into effect in 2005. Since then, one reason our exports have grown to Chile is because of that. We're up to 18% of their market share. But we still are, we've lost market share to Canada. And that's the other point in, you know, when you talk about educating the American people about trade, we act as if we are the only game in town, when in fact we're not. That's part of what globalization is. You can buy those products anywhere. There's some things we make where we're the only ones that make them, and that's terrific. But there are other products that we make where you can buy similar products in other countries, and countries, obviously, businesses make those decisions based on where they can get the best deal. I'm going to stop. I've talked too long. I apologize. I'd be delighted to answer questions, and I'm sure you're going to have a bunch of them.
Well, thank you very much. Ambassador, you've set the tone. The New York Times article that some of us saw in the papers this weekend mentioned that there are a couple of quid pro quos that the Speaker wants, and perhaps you could tell us the chances of getting, for example, increased trade adjustment assistance from the administration. I don't know that they're proposing any additional assistance at this point. That was one of the big issues. The others are added expenditures in various social benefits for labor, but it seemed to me that the most directly tied to trade was the trade adjustment issue.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Can you hear me if I just talk from here? You're okay? Yeah. I mean, I have a lady with a camera in the back. A couple things. I mean, as you may all have noticed, the White House is, the president's Republican and the Congress is controlled by the Democrats. So there's a normal and understandable tension between the administration and what in any other country would be called the opposition, right? The role of the opposition in any country is to oppose, right? That's where it comes from. And so what the Speaker of the House has said is that she wants to trade, and there are other things that she's interested in. Unfortunately, she has not given us, here's the 3 things I want. She just sort of said, well, for instance. So that makes it hard to negotiate if you don't know exactly. Imagine, when you go to buy a house, buy a car, the other person tells you what they want to sell it for, and you know what you want to buy it for, and you enter into a negotiation. Well, we're having a hard time finding out exactly what it is that the Speaker wants. But the one that's mentioned most often is trade adjustment assistance. And for those of y'all who don't know, it's an assistance program for workers who lose manufacturing jobs because they've gone abroad. Okay, the easiest way to think of it is a textile factory shuts down, it goes to another country, and this was assistance particularly tailored for the workers in that textile factory to help them retrain, in some cases help them relocate, so that they can find another job. And the Democrats want to expand that. The administration is negotiating with them on that. There is a bill that will be marked up next week in the Senate Finance Committee that, in fact, will expand trade adjustment assistance. The question is obviously you've got 2 sides. One wants to expand it they would say responsibly. The other side wants to expand it, they would say responsibly. And how do you find what that midpoint is part of our political process. But I would guess that will go through the Congress and will pass, if Congress has time to do it in this session of Congress, because of course our Congress is very anxious to go home and campaign. All 435 members are up for re-election in the House, and a third of the Senate's up for re-election, and even those who aren't up for re-election want to campaign for their national candidate, for their presidential candidate. So they're anxious to get out of town. They will go into recess in August, and they could come back in September, and they could come back after the election for a lame duck session of Congress, although the Democrats in the House right now are saying that there will be no lame duck session. So all this is part of our very dynamic, ongoing political process.
Questions? Yeah.
If you could turn to the Latin side for just a second and look at, has the Chavez populism run its course? The Kirchners are obviously having problems. Chavez is having problems. Is the anti-Washington census, if you want to put that in quotation marks, in Latin America, is that running its course? Or are we seeing a breaking of the ice there?
Let me turn your question around the other way. First of all, what we want to clearly there are people in Latin America who are more or less anti-American, and it varies from country to country. And to treat Latin America as a single entity that does not make sense. What we want to have is terrific relations with everybody. We had a team led by my boss, Tom Shannon, that was in Buenos Aires on Friday and met with President Fernandez de Kirchner, and we're trying to work through some issues there. And I have not talked to Tom since he's returned. He came back over the weekend, and I left over the weekend. But from all that I understand, they were terrific talks. To my way of thinking, the real issue in Latin America is that part of the population that does not participate in the formal economy of their nations, okay? And we don't even have this concept in English of formal economy and informal economy. It's the people who don't get paid every 2 weeks, the people who are selling stuff on street corners. It's subsistence farmers in Mexico. It's businesses in Peru, some of which have a lot of employees, but businesses are not incorporated. Right? So they're not paying tax, they're not paying the employees the benefits they ought to be getting. What we want to see happen, and when I say we, I mean we in this administration, we in the last administration, and I'm going to bet you we in the next administration, What we want to see happen is countries with representative democracies and open economies be successful, right? We want them to be able to deliver to their citizens the benefit of good governance, right? Better schools, roads, health care. That is, we want to see people move from the informal economy to the formal economy. Trade agreements is one tool in the toolbox. Not every country wants to have an agreement with the United States, and that's fine. These three countries in particular, Peru, Colombia, Panama, do. What we believe is going to happen in Colombia with this is it will make the Colombian economy grow more quickly. The benefits that they have now that gives them duty-free access to the United States have to be renewed every few months. They expire on the 31st of December. If our Congress doesn't act before then, election year, they're going out, they would expire. And so the duty on coffee and flowers and you name it, suddenly there is one. And so people who are going to invest in Colombia want to know that those benefits are permanent. Whether they're Colombian investors or foreign investors doesn't make any difference. They want to know that those benefits are permanent. And what, according to the United Nations Economic Council for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, CEPAL, for every additional 1% growth in an economy, poverty drops by 1.5%. I mean, Americans, we love to talk about the threat. The threat in Latin America is poverty. 190 million people in Latin America and the Caribbean live in poverty. And that's what you're really talking about, and that's what you see manifest in a lot of the anti-Americanism in a number of countries, in some cases in the government, in some cases in the opposition, is ironically a rejection of globalization, just like the worker at the GM plant in Doraville, right? A rejection of globalization, a rejection of the economy, a sort of desire for the good old days, which most places really weren't that good. They were old, but they weren't that good. And it's associated with the United States. And so that anti-Americanism is a reflection of, I've been living in poverty and I'm unhappy about that. My government hasn't paid attention to me and I want them to pay attention to me. Actually, Colombia is a terrific example. Here's a country which I'm sure you've been reading about it a lot lately because of the hostage rescue, but a country that 10 years ago was on the brink of being a failed state. Poverty was rampant, drug trafficking was out of control, paramilitaries were out of control and drug trafficking on the right, the guerrillas were out of control and drug trafficking on the left to finance their activities. There were large portions of Colombia that American diplomats, when I visited there, I wasn't allowed to go to. Colombians were fleeing their country, moving to other places. And in the past 10 years, with a lot of assistance from the United States, with bipartisan assistance from the United States, it started under President Clinton, by the way, with the previous president of Colombia, and continued with President Bush and the current president of Colombia, the country is absolutely turned around and the economy is growing, and as a result, the percentage of the population living in poverty has dropped and dropped dramatically. And that's what you want to see happen. And what this agreement will do will help them lock it in. I mean, the shorthand version of what these agreements are is good for the United States, right? They're going to help our exports. In this case, it's good for Colombia. It's going to help Colombia grow more quickly. And it's good for our national security interests. We want countries that are representative democracies, let me underline that, representative democracies, not popular democracies or participatory democracies or any other sort of crazy thing you can think of, with open economies. I'm not necessarily, copying us, for every jot and tittle. We want them to be successful, and that's exactly what's happening in Colombia. That's exactly what's happening in Peru. That's exactly what's happening in Panama, and we want to help them continue that.
The tariff-free, is the tariff-free situation in all three countries on a renewable basis?
Yeah.
So that's the carrot for these countries.
Well, it's
Otherwise, you may ask, what's in it for Colombia, unless there's an investment regime?
well, first of all, it's not just these three countries. We have the Andean Trade Preferences Act is for Ecuador, Bolivia, Colombia, and Peru. It's been in effect, I think, since 1988. Is that right? That gives them duty-free access to the United States. It has to be renewed periodically. And then there's the Caribbean Basin Initiative, which we remember from back in the 70s. It gives the Central American Caribbean countries duty-free access to the United States for most, but not all of their products. They have to be renewed periodically, but it's not just the renewal. It's easy when you talk about these agreements to talk about tariffs, but they involve much, much more. Everything from e-commerce, government procurement, intellectual property rights protection, protection for investment, a whole bunch of things that actually what it represents with Colombia is the normalization of our trade relations with Colombia. Rather than Colombia being an exceptional case that needs exceptional treatment, it is that Colombia has become such a normal country that we want to have really normalized trade relations with Colombia, and that will help Colombia because it will help the Colombian economy grow more quickly, help the United States, and it's good for our interests.
Mr. Ambassador, the Council on Foreign Relations just released a report that is rather detailed concerning U.S.-Latin American relations, and they paint an entirely different picture as to the emerging role, the current role of the United States in Latin America, and that we're no longer the pivotal state. We have to realize that things have changed for some of the reasons you already enunciated, and we have to start doing things very much differently down there than we have in the past. Mexico, security is a big issue, of course.
Sure.
The trade issues we've talked about, new coalitions, the rise of Brazil. Do you find in Washington a wide feeling of support for this sort of thing?
I'm sorry, which sort of thing? The trade.
For this new attitude that we've got to assume toward Latin America as opposed to the Yankee imperialism of the past?
Okay, a couple things. First of all, from my perspective, from our perspective, the idea that the United States is not the pivotal country in Latin America is good, not bad. And what we want Latin American countries to have is great relations with Europe, great relations with Asia, great relations with everywhere else. As Asia grows, trade with Asia from Latin America is growing very, very rapidly. That's terrific. That's great. We're not the only game in town anymore. We want to be, I think we're still a very key country for everybody in America. They want to trade with us. We want to trade with them. That's terrific. Brazil has emerged as certainly a world economic power and as a continental political power. That's good. That's success. I think what the Council on Foreign Relations is recognizing the success of Latin America, not the failure of the United States, but the success of Latin America. I'll go back to something as simple as these trade agreements. It is an option for countries. Do they want to negotiate a trade agreement with the United States or not? It's not a demand by the United States. Mercosur has decided no, they don't want to negotiate with the United States at this time. That's fine. What we want to see is Latin American countries trade more with each other. We want to see them trade more with Europe, more with Asia, and we also want to see them trade more with us. More prosperous countries or more stable countries. The Council on Foreign Relations report is an interesting and excellent report, but part of their perspective, I think, is paints as dire something that I actually see as positive.
What's the status of the agreement with Panama?
Well, first of all, these agreements are bilateral agreements. It's not a group agreement like CAFTA.
Right.
Traditionally, historically, we've always sent the agreements to Congress in the order in which they are negotiated. These were signed Peru, Colombia, Panama. So as soon as we finish Colombia, we'll go to Panama. And the fact is that on Panama, right now there's probably not support in Congress for political reasons to go ahead with the Panama agreement because of an internal political issue in Panama, and that I hope will be resolved on the 1st of September. And then, we'll see. If we get the Colombia agreement done, we will go ahead with the Panama agreement.
Yes.
I was actually curious to know what type of role NGOs are playing in developing economic policy, especially in Colombia, if any. But I didn't know if you knew anything about that or not.
I know a lot about it. Look, first of all, one of the things that I think...
could repeat the question.
Okay, the question is, what's the role of NGOs in economic policy in Latin America? The specific answer is it varies widely from country to country, of course, as you would think it would. But one of the things that I find sort of extraordinary about Latin America is, you get off the airplane, go to the capital of, any country in Latin America, and there are U.S. NGOs there working, faith-based organizations, civic organizations, policy organizations, development organizations that are working, and that the U.S. Embassy, rightly, doesn't even know about, right? I mean, the sort of official bilateral relations, it's sort of interesting, is just a small portion of the total relations between the United States and Argentina, the United States and Colombia, the United States and Mexico. I mean, there are tremendous things going on, and there are organizations that are doing all kinds of work. That, you open the paper and it turns out that, Rotary Club has got rotoplas to send doctors down that are doing operations on kids. That human rights organizations, environmental organizations, labor organizations, churches that you never heard of, and local churches that are working with their counterpart churches in the countries. And importantly is the relationship between nationals of the country in the United States with their home country, both informally in terms of remittances to family members, but also formally with organizations that are like hometown associations to help their hometown and send money home and direct that money in a particular way. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary.
What is being done to try to bring organized labor on board? Because your major opposition comes from organized labor.
Yeah.
Some of the comments and problems are real, and others are really not due to trade at all, but globalization.
Well, first of all, the AFL-CIO, I mean, their job is to look after labor. I mean, that's what they do, and that's fine, and I understand that. And AFL-CIO does not support any trade agreement with any country anywhere. Okay? I mean, they'll tell you that. With Peru, they didn't actively oppose. They're actively opposing the Colombia agreement. I mean, if you ask them about Peru, they say, no, we don't like it. But they're actively opposing on Colombia.
What about the subsidies that the U.S. give to the farmers, and what is going to be, how is the equality between a trade of agricultural products to Colombia that have already these big subsidies? Because
Okay.
we, of course, don't have subsidies to our agricultural.
Okay, let me finish this, and then I'll get to that. Okay, I'm sorry. And so AFL-CIO is, first of all, takes its lead from the Colombian Trade Confederation, and the Colombian Trade Confederation opposes the agreement because they oppose the president politically, not because of, it's not going to, the vast majority of the Colombian Trade Confederation is in fact public employees. I'm a public employee. But public employees will not be affected one way or the other by this agreement. So public employees are never put out of business, right? Unfortunately or fortunately from your perspective. But their stated concern is violence against labor union members in Colombia. Violence against labor union members in Colombia. The human rights situation is improving dramatically. There are labor union members in Colombia who have been killed. There are city council members and reporters and business executives and others who have been killed. That rate is dropping rapidly. I'm convinced that if you want to have it continue to drop, we want this government in Colombia to be successful. The government that's doing all the right things is in fact responsible for the drop in that. Clearly, there is no number of people, whether it's newspaper reporters or labor union members or business executives who it's an acceptable number to be murdered. The correct number is 0, and that's what President Uribe has said, that the number should be 0. But having said that, the murder rate of trade union members in Colombia is lower than the murder rate for Colombians, the general murder rate. That doesn't make it okay, but you have to put it in perspective. The murder rate for trade union members in Colombia is lower than the murder rate in Washington, D.C., which I'm not happy about. Anyhow, that's that. Your question is about subsidies. I've talked extensively with the Minister of Agriculture of Colombia. First of all, there are phase-ins for the removing tariffs on U.S. agricultural products in each of these agreements. The longest being 18 years for chicken dark meat. And the idea is that will give Colombian farmers the opportunity to make the adjustments necessary that they do so that they can continue to compete. What the Colombian Minister of Agriculture says, and quite rightly, I think, is that Colombia needs to compete in tropical products, not in temperate climate products. And that's where Colombia can, in fact, best compete and do well. And, let me say this, one of the provisions of the agreement is, we have a 54-cent a gallon tariff on imported ethanol. With Colombia, it will be 0, right? So it opens up a tremendous market in the United States for ethanol produced from Colombian sugarcane, right? So, yeah. Just a footnote here for those of you who are students is, in any trade agreement between any two countries anywhere, the two most sensitive items are always textiles and agriculture. Textiles and agriculture, because there's a lot of jobs in textiles and agriculture, and people are always very, very nervous about it. And those were the last items to be negotiated in the agreement with Colombia was agriculture, precisely because it is so sensitive.
Other questions? I think you've done such a good job.
Oh.
Sold on
Talked them
your
out.
message.
Thank you very much. Let me leave you with 3 points. This agreement is good for the United States, it's good for Colombia, and it's good for our national interests. Exactly the question about radicalism. It's good for our national interests in Latin America to have this agreement go through and have governments like that in Peru and that in Colombia and that in Panama be successful. Thank you all very much.